There are games that fail, and then there are games that should have saved everything. The Wolf Among Us was a series that was supposed to do that for Telltale Games. It had incredible writing, incredible tone, the world was right, the setting, the atmosphere, everything was perfect. Everything that they needed to evolve as a game studio was right there. So why is it that Telltale's best game, one of their best games, came right before everything ended? Because The Wolf Among Us didn't actually save Telltale Games, it exposed them. To understand why The Wolf Among Us was a game that mattered, you have to understand what Telltale was at the time that the game came out. After the first season of The Walking Dead, Telltale Games wasn't just a story-driven video game studio, it was the video game story-driven studio. These guys were white hot, and they figured out something that nobody else had figured out before, and that is you didn't need perfect gameplay, you needed emotional investment. Because if you have that, it doesn't really matter when players aren't just pressing buttons, they're making decisions, they're saving people, losing people, and living with it. That formula worked. It hid the flaws of this format of video game. This formula worked so well that Telltale built their entire identity around it. And one of those installments that Telltale released, in addition to The Walking Dead, that further cemented themselves as the pristine video game story-driven studios out there, was The Wolf Among Us. This wasn't like The Walking Dead survival horror, and this wasn't emotional drama. This was something darker and more mature and more dangerous. The World of Fables is a story that is built around a simple idea, and that is fairy tale characters from the books that you've read when you were a kid being forced into real life issues. But Telltale didn't treat that like a fantasy, they treated that idea like it was reality. When you take these characters off the page and putting them into real life, you start to see things. For example, Snow White wasn't a princess, she's a government official trying to hold together a broken system. Beauty and the Beast aren't romantic, they're in a toxic, failing relationship trying to figure out how to make it work. And Bigby Wolf, he's not the big bad wolf anymore, he's the sheriff of Fabletown. But the thing about Bigby is that you never fully believe that he's changed. Now that is his character arc, that's what makes him so compelling, but at the same time, you as the player playing through Bigby Wolf in this story are left kind of playing with yourself in a way. Pause. Every choice you make reinforces the tension. Do you control him, or do you let him become what he used to be? And the game never gives you a clean answer, really. But players noticed almost immediately how special The Wolf Among Us was. They noticed the tone, they noticed the writing, they noticed the atmosphere, the soundtrack. They noticed how everything worked. For a moment, it looked like Telltale had evolved, taken that natural next step into becoming something grander. And The Wolf Among Us, just like The Walking Dead, would have been something that would have catapulted them even further down the path that they were hoping to go. It's like they had taken their formula and they pushed it forward, but the issue was underneath what was such a perfect video game is when you find out that nothing had actually changed for the studio at all. Doing something impossible here in trying to strip The Wolf Among Us down to its core, in reality, it's the same system, it's the same structure, it's the same illusion of choice. And that illusion, after a while, when it comes to Telltale Games, started to crack. At first, players didn't really notice the writing was strong enough to carry it all, but over time, patterns started to emerge. Your choices felt important in the moment, but later they led to the same outcomes. Different dialogue, same results. And once players realized that, the magic started to fade, and here's the problem. Instead of slowing down, Telltale sped up. They didn't refine the formula, they multiplied it. They released Game of Thrones, they released Batman, they released Guardians of the Galaxy, they released Borderlands. These were new stories, new characters, kind of the same experiences over and over and over again. But here's where The Wolf Among Us became so important, because it proved something that the other games didn't, and that is the formula wasn't the problem, the lack of evolution in the studio was. Because even the games that I just mentioned, yes, the formula of story-based decision-making, storytelling was a flaw in the studio, no doubt. The more Telltale Games people started to play, the more that they realized that their choices ultimately didn't really matter all that much. But regardless, Batman and Borderlands had fantastic stories too, so you can almost forgive it. But The Wolf Among Us showed that Telltale Studios could go deeper, they could go darker, they can make things more complex. But instead of building on that, they stayed safe, and in doing so, they created a gap between what they could be and a gap between what they chose to be. And behind the scenes, behind the curtain, under the studio, all while this was happening, things were getting worse. As Telltale started to release more games, reports started to come out about the crunch. I talked a little bit about this on the channel before whenever Dispatch originally came out and how impressed I was with that game, but employees at the studio were facing incredibly long hours, unbelievable burnout, and just ridiculous layoffs. Developers at Telltale Studios were being pushed to produce more content, and they were pushed to do it faster than they ever have before, faster than what was expected or even possible. But they were expected to do it without the time to improve the system and the formula underneath it that made it run. And eventually that catches up to you as a business, because players weren't just comparing Telltale to themselves anymore, they were comparing them to the rest of the industry. And the industry was evolving. There was more choice, more consequences, more depth, while Telltale stayed the same. And when that happens, it doesn't matter how good your writing is, eventually people stop showing up. And suddenly, as people stop showing up, Telltale Games as a studio completely vanished off the map. But before they did so, Telltale announced their unicorn in a way, the thing that was gonna put them back on track and back in fighting contention was The Wolf Among Us 2. Now there was a couple teasers and a couple really great looking trailers that came out from this game, but for the last few years, Telltale has been radio silent. Fans have no idea if this game is even coming out anymore. There's multiple rumors talking about how the system of The Wolf Among Us potentially is being made to work with a newer generation system. There's just rumblings, but nothing official from the studio. There's rumors and there's leaks, and who knows what's really going on with The Wolf Among Us Part 2. But obviously, with the original Wolf Among Us being so special to that Telltale catalog, there's hope that The Wolf Among Us 2 is gonna be just as special or even more so, and possibly, finally, that establishment of change and growth in evolution in the studio. Things got quiet for a little while, and of course Ad Hoc Studios, the company or the gaming studio that ended up leaving Telltale Games, that were working on The Wolf Among Us 2 originally, whenever they went out and made Dispatch, which is probably the best game of 2025, that game was so good that it brought hope and, I guess, belief back in story-driven decision-making video games, something that we haven't seen since prime Telltale era. So now, with Dispatch being as good as it was, with that team originally working on The Wolf Among Us Part 2, The Wolf Among Us Part 2 has kind of become a unicorn in a way, a symbol for hope. And whether Wolf Among Us 2 hasn't come out because of the absolute shambles that Telltale Games has been in for a studio, or it hasn't come out yet because they're trying to get that game up to the expectations of people, I think the mystery of it all leaves interest. But regardless, the longer that it doesn't come out, the longer that it becomes a game that holds Telltale on a string, just dangling in front of fans, not allowing that studio to die, which can either be a good thing if they truly ever want to make a comeback, or is a bad thing for the owners of the studio if they want their studio to just disappear in silence. But in the end, The Wolf Among Us didn't destroy Telltale Games. It proved that they were already breaking. It showed us what they were capable of, what their stories could feel like, what their games could become, and it showed us what happens when you don't evolve. Because sometimes your best work isn't your peak, it's your warning. And that's what makes The Wolf Among Us so unforgettable. Not just because it was great, but because it showed us everything Telltale failed to become. If you enjoyed The Wolf Among Us as much as I did, which I'd imagine you probably did, because it is damn near just one of the best games I've ever played. It's so sad that it's been so long since it's come out, and I really hope that The Wolf Among Us 2 is the thing to kind of turn that whole franchise around. I guess we'll see. And by franchise, I mean that entire studio. But if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It really does help a lot. Please leave a comment to show YouTube, hey, we're here. If you want to see more videos that we do in the future, please click subscribe, click the notification bell so you never miss a video. That would also help a lot as well. And I will see you guys in the next one. Peace, love, adios, and bye-bye.